The morning started like any other morning at St. Catherine's School for Girls. Sister Margaret walked down the long corridor, her soft footsteps barely making a sound on the polished floors. She had walked the same path for 40 years, and she knew every crack in the walls, every window that let in the morning sun just right. She was 73 years old now, and her hands weren't what they used to be. The arthritis made her fingers stiff, especially in the cold months. But that never stopped her from teaching. Music was her life. The piano was her voice. When she reached her classroom, she paused at the door like she always did. Through the small window, she could see her piano sitting in the corner, waiting for her. It was an old, upright piano, nothing fancy, but it had a warm sound that filled the room like honey. Inside, the morning light painted golden squares on the wooden floor. Sister Margaret smiled and set her worn music books on the desk. In 2 hours, her first students would arrive, eager and nervous, ready to learn. Some of them had been with her for years. Others were just beginning their journey with music. She walked to the piano and sat down slowly, her joints protesting a bit. Her fingers found the keys and she played a few scales to warm up. The notes weren't as crisp as they used to be. Her left hand sometimes lagged behind her right, but there was still beauty in it. There was still soul. That's when she heard the knock on her door. It was Mrs. Chen, the school secretary. The woman looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Sister Margaret, Mr. Patterson would like to see you in his office." Mr. Patterson was the new headmaster. He had arrived 6 months ago, fresh from some prestigious academy in the city. He wore expensive suits and talked about modernization and innovation constantly. Sister Margaret had barely spoken to him. She taught her classes and he ran his meetings, and their paths rarely crossed. "Do you know what it's about?" Sister Margaret asked, standing up from the piano bench. Mrs. Chen wouldn't meet her eyes. "He'll explain everything." The walk to the headmaster's office felt longer than usual. Sister Margaret passed classrooms full of young girls in their uniforms, their voices bright with morning energy. She passed the library where she used to help students research composers. She passed the chapel where she sometimes played organ on Sundays. Mr. Patterson's office was on the 3rd floor, in what used to be a music rehearsal room. He had renovated it completely. Now it had glass walls, modern furniture, and a large computer screen that seemed to glow with importance. He stood when she entered, giving her a practiced smile. "Sister Margaret, please sit down." She sat in the leather chair across from his desk. It was too soft, too low. She felt small in it. "I'll get straight to the point," he said, folding his hands on the desk. "The board and I have been reviewing all our programs, looking for ways to improve student outcomes and prepare our girls for the future." Sister Margaret nodded, not sure where this was going. "Your dedication to this school is remarkable. 40 years is an incredible achievement." He paused, and she knew that pause. It was the pause before bad news. "However, we need to think about what's best for the students in today's world. Music education has changed. Technology has changed everything." Her heart began to beat faster. "We've decided to restructure the music program. We're bringing in a specialist who teaches contemporary methods, incorporates digital tools, prepares students for modern music careers." He said it all in one breath, like he'd practiced it. "Your teaching style, while traditional and certainly heartfelt, doesn't align with our new direction." Sister Margaret felt the words hit her like cold water. "I don't understand. Are you asking me to learn new methods? I can learn. I've always been willing to." "We're reassigning you," he interrupted gently, "to administrative duties. You'll help Mrs. Chen with filing, phone calls, organizing records. Important work. Essential to keeping the school running smoothly." The room seemed to tilt slightly. "And the piano classes?" "We'll continue with our new instructor. He starts next month." "He," she repeated softly. "Yes, a young man with excellent credentials. He's worked with conservatory students, uses the latest software. Really quite impressive." Sister Margaret looked down at her hands, at the fingers that had taught hundreds of girls how to find middle C, how to read notes, how to feel the rhythm of a waltz or the sadness of a minor key. These hands had held the hands of students who were nervous, students who cried when they finally played their first song all the way through, students who came back years later to thank her for teaching them something beautiful. "What about my students?" she asked quietly. "The girls I'm teaching now? They'll transition to the new instructor. It'll be seamless. Children are adaptable." But Sister Margaret knew it wouldn't be seamless. She knew the shy girl in her Tuesday class who was just starting to open up through music. She knew the talented student who needed gentle guidance, not modern pressure. She knew each of them, their struggles and their strengths. "When?" she asked. "We'll make the change at the end of this week. That gives you time to wrap up and say your goodbyes." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him that music wasn't about software and modern careers. It was about beauty, about discipline, about giving young souls a way to express what words couldn't say. But she saw the look in his eyes. The decision was made. She was being dismissed. "I understand," she said, even though she didn't. Even though it felt like her whole world was crumbling. She stood up slowly and walked to the door. "Sister Margaret," he called after her, "we really do appreciate everything you've done." She didn't turn around. She just kept walking. 3 days later, she stood in her classroom for the last time. 2 maintenance workers had come to move the piano out. They were strong young men who lifted it onto a dolly with ease like it weighed nothing at all. Sister Margaret watched from beside the window, her hands clasped together. The piano rolled past her through the doorway, down the hall. She could hear the wheels squeaking as they took it further and further away. The room felt empty without it. Just a desk, some chairs, bare walls where music posters used to hang. One of the workers came back for the piano bench. "You okay, sister?" he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. When they were gone, she walked to the spot where the piano had been. There was a lighter rectangle on the floor where it had protected the wood from the sun. 40 years of music and now just a mark on the floor. Sister Margaret stood there for a long time, looking at that empty space, feeling something inside her go quiet and still. Then she turned off the lights and closed the door behind her. The next morning, she reported to the administrative office. Mrs. Chen showed her the filing cabinets, the phone system, the schedule she'd need to maintain. It was all very organized, very efficient, very silent. There was no music anymore, just the sound of papers shuffling and phones ringing and time passing slowly, one quiet day after another. The filing cabinets were gray. Everything in the administrative office was gray or beige or some other color that seemed designed to make you forget where you were. Sister Margaret spent her days sorting papers, answering phones, and updating records that nobody seemed to look at. She tried to find purpose in it. She really did. Every morning she told herself that this work mattered too. Someone had to organize the files. Someone had to answer when parents called. Someone had to keep track of all the forms and documents that kept a school running. But her heart wasn't in it. The worst part was the silence. Not the quiet kind of silence that comes before a beautiful piece of music. This was different. This was the silence of emptiness, of something missing, of days that stretched out with nothing to fill them. Mrs. Chen was kind, at least. She never made Sister Margaret feel useless, even though they both knew the truth. Most of the work could have been done by anyone. There was nothing special about filing papers in alphabetical order. "Could you update the attendance records?" Mrs. Chen would ask gently. Or, "Would you mind calling these parents about the field trip forms?" And Sister Margaret would do it, her arthritic fingers moving slowly across the keyboard, her voice polite and professional on the phone. But inside she felt like she was fading away, becoming as gray as the filing cabinets. Every day around 2 in the afternoon, she could hear music coming from down the hall. Her old classroom. The new instructor had arrived, just as Mr. Patterson promised. His name was Trevor, and he was 28 years old. He wore jeans and graphic t-shirts with band names on them. He carried a laptop everywhere and had set up speakers and electronic keyboards in the room where her piano used to be. The sounds that came from that room were different. Electronic beats, synthesized melodies. Sometimes she could hear him explaining to students about music production software, about how to make beats on a computer, about opportunities in the music industry. The students seemed to like him. She could hear them laughing, excited about the modern equipment. And Sister Margaret tried to be happy about that. She really did. If the girls were learning, if they were finding joy in music, wasn't that what mattered? But late at night, alone in her small room at the convent, she wondered if they were really learning about music. Or were they just learning about technology? The other sisters noticed the change in her. Sister Ruth, who taught mathematics, started sitting with her at lunch. Sister Angela, the youngest of them at 52, tried to draw her into conversations about the garden or the upcoming church festival. But Sister Margaret felt disconnected from everything. She smiled and nodded and pretended to be fine, but inside she felt hollow. One Tuesday afternoon, she was carrying a stack of files down the corridor when she passed her old classroom. The door was open. Trevor was working on his laptop and the room was empty of students. She slowed down, unable to help herself. The room looked completely different. Where her piano had been, there was now a desk with computers and electronic equipment. Colorful posters about famous pop musicians covered the walls. Everything was bright and modern and nothing like she remembered. Trevor looked up and saw her standing there. "Oh, hey," he said, friendly enough. "You're Sister Margaret, right? The one who used to teach here." Used to, past tense, like she was already history. "Yes," she said quietly. "Cool room, right? I've really been able to set up some great stuff. The kids love it." He gestured at his equipment with obvious pride. "We're doing a unit on electronic music production. They're going to create their own tracks." Sister Margaret nodded. She wanted to say something, but what could she say? That she missed the sound of fingers on real piano keys? That she believed music should be felt in your hands and your heart, not just programmed on a screen? "Did you ever do anything with technology?" Trevor asked. "When you taught?" "I taught them to read music," she said. "To understand rhythm and melody. To feel the emotion in each piece." Trevor smiled, but it was the kind of smile adults give children when they don't really understand. "Yeah, that's great. That foundation stuff is important. But we've got to prepare them for the real world, you know? The music industry is all digital now." Sister Margaret clutched her files tighter and nodded. Then she walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. That evening, during dinner at the convent, she barely touched her food. The other sisters exchanged worried glances. Finally, Sister Ruth spoke up. "You need to talk to someone, Margaret. You're not yourself." "I'm fine," Sister Margaret said automatically. "You're not fine," Sister Angela said gently. "We can all see it." "You're fading away." Sister Margaret set down her fork. For a long moment, she just stared at her plate. Then quietly she said, "I don't know who I am anymore. For 40 years I was the music teacher. That's what I did. That's who I was. And now," her voice trailed off. The other sisters waited. "Now I'm just someone who files papers. Anyone could do what I do. I'm not needed. I'm not important. I'm just taking up space." Sister Ruth reached across the table and took her hand. "You are not just taking up space. You're a teacher. You're a musician. You're someone who gave everything to those girls for 40 years. That doesn't just disappear because some young man with a computer shows up." But Sister Margaret wasn't sure she believed that anymore. The days blurred together. Monday felt like Tuesday felt like Wednesday. She went through the motions, but there was no joy in any of it. She stopped humming while she worked. She stopped looking forward to anything. Sometimes, during her lunch break, she would walk to the chapel. It was quiet there, peaceful. She would sit in the back pew and her fingers would move unconsciously, playing invisible scales on the wooden bench in front of her. Her muscle memory was so strong that her hands remembered every key, every chord progression, every piece she'd ever taught. But there was no sound, just silent movement, just the memory of music. One afternoon in late October, she was sorting through old school records when she overheard voices outside the office. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. The door was just slightly open and the voices carried. It was Mr. Patterson talking to someone. Another administrator, maybe. "I know it seems harsh," Mr. Patterson was saying, "but we can't let sentiment get in the way of progress. The old nun had her time. Now we need fresh energy," the other voice laughed. "Putting her out to pasture, are we?" "Something like that. Though between you and me, I think she's more useful filing papers. Her teaching methods were outdated years ago. The girls need someone who understands modern music." They walked away, their voices fading down the corridor. Sister Margaret sat frozen at her desk, the file still open in her hands. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not anger exactly, something deeper. Something that felt like the final breaking of hope. That night, back in her room, she did something she hadn't done in decades. She cried. Not quiet tears, but deep, shaking sobs that came from somewhere so far down inside her that she didn't know she could still feel that much. She cried for the loss of her classroom. She cried for the piano that was gone. She cried for the students she'd never teach again. She cried for 40 years of devotion that seemed to mean nothing anymore. And she cried for herself. for the woman who had given everything to music and was now sitting alone in a small room with nothing but silence and memories. When the tears finally stopped, she sat on the edge of her bed, exhausted. Her hands were shaking. She looked down at her fingers, at the swollen knuckles and the age spots and the stiffness that never quite went away. These hands had made music. These hands had taught so many girls to love something beautiful. These hands had mattered once. In the darkness of her room, Sister Margaret made a decision. She wouldn't cry anymore. She would accept what had happened. She would do her filing and answer her phones and live out her days quietly, without complaint. She would fade away, just like they wanted her to. The music was over. It was time to accept that. November arrived with cold winds and gray skies. The school prepared for its biggest event of the year, the annual fundraising gala. It was always held the Saturday before Thanksgiving, and it was the kind of event that people talked about for months. Sister Margaret had never attended before. The gala was for wealthy donors, important alumni, and community leaders, the kind of people who wrote large checks and made decisions about the school's future. She had always been in her small room at the convent during those evenings, content to let the important people do their important business. But this year was different. Mr. Patterson had made attendance mandatory for all staff members. "We need to show unity," he'd said at the morning meeting. "We need everyone there to represent St. Catherine's excellence." So Sister Margaret found herself sitting in the auditorium on a cold Saturday evening in November. Wearing her simple black habit among a sea of evening gowns and expensive suits, she sat in the very back row trying to be invisible. The auditorium looked transformed. They decorated it with white lights and elegant flower arrangements. Round tables covered in cream-colored cloths filled the main floor. A stage at the front held a beautiful grand piano, microphone stands, and what looked like a lot of electronic equipment covered with black cloths. Sister Margaret counted the people as they arrived. Easily 300 guests, maybe more. Women in jewelry that probably cost more than a year of her teaching salary. Men in tailored suits checking their phones. Everyone looking successful and important. She recognized some faces. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been a student 30 years ago and now owned a chain of restaurants. Dr. Patel, whose daughter had taken piano lessons 15 years back and was now a surgeon. The mayor was there. A state senator. People who mattered. The evening began with dinner. Sister Margaret picked at her food, feeling out of place. The woman next to her, wearing a silk dress and diamond earrings, tried to make conversation. "Do you work at the school?" the woman asked politely. "I'm in administration," Sister Margaret said quietly. It was easier than explaining. After dinner, Mr. Patterson took the stage. He looked confident in his expensive suit, his smile bright under the spotlight. He talked about the school's bright future, about innovation and excellence, about preparing young women for success in the modern world. "Tonight," he announced, "we have a special treat. Our new music instructor, Trevor Walsh, has prepared a performance that showcases the cutting-edge direction of our music program. He'll be using the latest technology to demonstrate how we're preparing our students for careers in the contemporary music industry." The audience applauded. Sister Margaret's hands stayed folded in her lap. Trevor took the stage looking excited. 2 students came up to help him, pulling the black cloths off the equipment. There were synthesizers, electronic keyboards, a laptop connected to large speakers, and a control board with dozens of buttons and lights. "Good evening, everyone," Trevor said into the microphone. His voice was young and enthusiastic. "What you're about to hear is a fusion of classical themes and modern electronic production. This represents the future of music education." He moved to his equipment and pressed some buttons. Nothing happened. He frowned and tried again. Still nothing. The audience shifted in their seats. Uncomfortable silence filled the room. Trevor laughed nervously. "Just a technical issue. Give me 1 second." He unplugged something and plugged it back in. He typed on his laptop. He checked the speakers. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The audience's polite patience was wearing thin. People started whispering to each other. Someone coughed. Chairs creaked. Mr. Patterson came up on stage trying to help. They checked every connection, every cable, every power source. Nothing worked. The equipment was completely dead. Trevor's face had gone red. He looked panicked, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," he said into the microphone. "I don't understand what happened. Everything was working this afternoon." Mr. Patterson took the microphone, his confident smile now tight and forced. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this technical difficulty. Unfortunately, it seems we won't be able to present our musical performance this evening. Perhaps we can move on to— Excuse me. A voice rang out from the front of the room. An elderly woman stood up, elegant in a navy blue dress. She had white hair swept up in a bun and eyes that were sharp and clear. Sister Margaret recognized her. Mrs. Helen Whitmore. She'd been one of Sister Margaret's very first students over 40 years ago. Back then, she'd been a shy girl named Helen, who could barely reach the piano pedals. Now she was one of the wealthiest women in the state, a philanthropist whose donations had built the school's library. "I'd like to say something," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice carrying across the silent room. Mr. Patterson looked uncertain but gestured for her to continue. "You didn't say no to Helen Whitmore. I've been coming to this gala for 20 years, she said, turning to face the audience. "And I've heard many performances, some good, some excellent, but I've always wondered why we never asked the woman who taught most of us here to play." Sister Margaret's heart started beating faster. "Is Sister Margaret here tonight?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, scanning the crowd. 300 heads turned, looking around. Sister Margaret felt frozen in her seat at the back of the room. "There," someone pointed. "In the back." Spotlights swung around, finding her. Sister Margaret blinked in the sudden brightness, her face hot with embarrassment. Mrs. Whitmore smiled. "Sister Margaret taught me piano when I was 7 years old. She taught me to love music. She taught me discipline and beauty, and how to express feelings I didn't have words for." She paused. "And unless I'm mistaken, there's a perfectly good grand piano on that stage that doesn't need any electricity or fancy equipment." The audience murmured. Some people were nodding, others looked curious. "Sister Margaret," Mrs. Whitmore called out, "would you play something for us, please?" The applause started small but grew quickly. People were clapping, turning to look at her, waiting. Sister Margaret felt paralyzed. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't played in front of anyone in months. Her arthritis was worse than ever. She couldn't possibly. But the applause continued. It was expectant now, encouraging. And in the front row, Mrs. Whitmore was smiling at her with such warmth, such genuine affection, that Sister Margaret felt something stir inside her chest. Something that had been dormant for months. Mr. Patterson stood on the stage looking uncomfortable. He forced a smile and gestured toward the piano. "Of course. Sister Margaret, please, if you'd like to." If she'd like to. As if this was his idea. As if he hadn't spent the last 3 months making her feel worthless. Sister Margaret stood slowly. Her legs felt weak. The walk from the back of the auditorium to the stage seemed impossibly long. Every step echoed in the silent room. 300 pairs of eyes watched her. She passed rows of tables. She passed people in expensive clothes who probably didn't remember her, who probably thought she was just some old nun they'd never noticed before. She passed Trevor, who stepped aside awkwardly, his electronic equipment useless behind him. She climbed the 3 steps to the stage. They felt steep. Her knees protested, but she made it. And there, in the center of the stage, sat the grand piano. It was beautiful. Black and glossy, much finer than the old upright she'd taught with. The bench looked soft, professional. Sister Margaret walked to it slowly. Her hands were trembling so much she had to clasp them together. What if she couldn't do this anymore? What if her arthritis was too bad? What if she embarrassed herself in front of all these important people? She sat down on the bench and looked out at the audience. 300 faces stared back at her, waiting. In the front row, Mrs. Whitmore gave her an encouraging nod. Sister Margaret looked down at the keys. Black and white, perfectly aligned, waiting. How many times had she sat at a piano? Thousands? Tens of thousands? Her whole life had been about these keys, about the music they could make. She lifted her hands and placed them on the keys. The ivory was cool and smooth under her fingertips. Her hands looked old, spotted with age, the knuckles swollen. But they remembered. After 40 years, they remembered. She took a breath, and she began to play. The first note rang out clear and pure across the silent auditorium. Sister Margaret's right hand found middle C, and for a moment, that single note hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Then her left hand joined in, and she began to play. It wasn't a grand classical piece. It wasn't Mozart or Beethoven or any of the composers that people expected to hear at fancy events like this. Instead, Sister Margaret played something simple, a lullaby, one she had written herself 35 years ago for a student who'd been afraid of the dark. The melody was gentle, like a mother's voice singing a child to sleep. Her arthritic fingers moved slowly across the keys, and yes, there was pain. Her knuckles ached. Her left hand didn't move as quickly as her right. But none of that mattered, because the music that came from the piano wasn't about technical perfection. It was about feeling. It was about memory. It was about love. Sister Margaret closed her eyes and let her hands do what they had done for 40 years. She didn't think about the 300 people watching her. She didn't think about Mr. Patterson, or Trevor, or the months of filing papers in gray offices. She just played. The lullaby ended softly, like a whisper fading into sleep. And without pausing, without opening her eyes, Sister Margaret moved into the next piece. This one was something she'd taught to her intermediate students, a simple waltz that captured the joy of a spring morning. Her fingers danced across the keys, and despite the arthritis, despite the months away from music, they remembered every note. The waltz was light and happy, full of the kind of innocent joy that only children and springtime can hold. In the audience, people had stopped shifting in their seats. They had stopped checking their phones. They were listening. Sister Margaret moved from the waltz into another piece and then another. Each song was something she'd taught over the years, a scale exercise she'd turned into a playful melody, a chord progression that captured the feeling of autumn leaves falling. A simple piece about rain that one of her students had loved so much she'd played it at her wedding. Every note carried a memory. Every melody held the echo of young voices, nervous laughter, the proud smile of a girl who'd finally mastered a difficult passage. 40 years of teaching, 40 years of caring, 40 years of believing that music mattered. All of it poured through her fingers and into the grand piano. In the front row, Mrs. Whitmore felt tears starting to form. She remembered being 7 years old, sitting on the piano bench next to Sister Margaret, learning that lullaby for the first time. She remembered how patient the nun had been, how she'd never made her feel stupid when she hit the wrong keys, how she'd celebrated every small victory like it was the most important thing in the world. 2 rows back, Dr. Patel pressed a hand to her mouth. She remembered learning that rain song when she was 12. She'd been going through a difficult time, her parents fighting constantly, and Sister Margaret had somehow known. The nun had never pried, never asked intrusive questions. She'd just taught her music, given her a safe place to feel her feelings. Let the piano say what words couldn't express. Throughout the auditorium, people were remembering. A businesswoman in a red dress remembered her first recital, how terrified she'd been, how Sister Margaret had sat in the front row and smiled encouragingly. A lawyer in an expensive suit remembered how the nun had come to his mother's funeral, how she'd played at the service even though it was her day off. A teacher remembered deciding on her career after watching how Sister Margaret treated her students with such kindness and respect, and the ones who hadn't been students were moved too. Because even if they'd never met this old nun before, even if they'd never heard her play, they could hear something in the music that went beyond notes and technique. They could hear a lifetime of devotion. They could hear genuine love for something beautiful. Sister Margaret played on, lost in the music now. Her hands hurt. Her back was starting to ache from sitting. But she couldn't stop. The music poured out of her like water that had been dammed up for too long. Every melody she'd ever taught, every simple song that had meant something to someone, they all came flowing back. She played a piece she'd written for a student who'd lost her grandmother. She played the silly song she'd made up to teach rhythm to beginners. She played the first song she'd ever learned herself, back when she was 5 years old and her own teacher had shown her the magic of making music. The transitions between pieces were seamless. She didn't pause, didn't announce what she was playing. She just let one song flow into the next, creating a medley of memories, a tapestry of 40 years woven together with melody and harmony. And then something happened. Mrs. Whitmore, sitting in the front row, began to hum along, very softly at first, almost without realizing she was doing it. The lullaby had come back around, and the melody was as familiar to her as her own name. The woman next to her recognized the song too. She'd heard her daughter practice it 1,000 times 20 years ago. She started humming as well. The sound grew. More people joined in. They hummed, they swayed gently in their seats. Some people's eyes were closed. Others were staring at the nun on stage with expressions of wonder or gratitude or something deeper that didn't have a name. And some people were crying. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears rolling down cheeks. The kind of tears that come when you're touched by something true, something real, something that reminds you what beauty actually means. Dr. Patel was crying, thinking about her daughter who was learning piano now, how she'd never appreciated before what a gift music was. The lawyer in the expensive suit was crying, remembering his mother, missing her suddenly with an ache that the years hadn't dulled. Mrs. Whitmore was crying too, tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. She was remembering what it felt like to be 7 years old and discover that her fingers could make something beautiful. Even people who had no connection to Sister Margaret felt something breaking open inside them. The music spoke to something universal: loneliness, hope, the passage of time, the things we lose and the things we keep, the quiet moments of grace that make life worth living. On stage, Sister Margaret felt it happening. Even with her eyes closed, she could sense the shift in the room. The silence had changed. It was no longer polite or expectant. It was reverent, sacred almost. She transitioned into the final piece, another simple melody, one she played every Christmas for her students. It was about light in the darkness, about hope in difficult times, about finding beauty in a world that often seemed too harsh. Her fingers moved across the keys with a tenderness that came from somewhere beyond technique. The pain in her hands had faded away, or maybe she just didn't notice it anymore. She was completely present in the music, completely surrendered to it. The final notes came softly, gently, like the end of a prayer. Sister Margaret played the last chord and let it ring out, sustaining it with the pedal until the sound faded naturally into silence. Then she lifted her hands from the keys. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The silence in the auditorium was complete. Sister Margaret opened her eyes. Her hands were shaking again, trembling with exhaustion and emotion. She looked out at the audience, uncertain. Had it been enough? Had she embarrassed herself? Had her old-fashioned music meant anything to these modern, sophisticated people? Then Mrs. Whitmore stood up. She was still crying, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too. She began to clap. Slowly at first, then faster, harder. The sound of her applause echoed through the silent room. The man next to her stood up and joined her. Then the woman behind them. Then a whole row. Then another. Within seconds, 300 people were on their feet. The applause was thunderous, filling the auditorium like a wave. It wasn't polite anymore. It wasn't the kind of clapping you do because you're supposed to. This was something different. This was gratitude. This was recognition. This was 300 people saying thank you to someone who had given everything for something beautiful. Sister Margaret sat at the piano bench, stunned. She pressed one hand to her mouth, overwhelmed. The applause went on and on. Sister Margaret sat at the piano, her hands still pressed to her mouth, trying to understand what was happening. She'd played simple songs, old songs, nothing impressive or modern or sophisticated. Yet 300 people stood before her, clapping until their hands must have hurt. She looked out at their faces and saw something she hadn't expected. They weren't just being polite. They were moved, really deeply moved. Mrs. Whitmore in the front row was still crying, smiling through her tears. Others had tears streaming down their faces too. Some people were laughing and crying at the same time. That strange mixture of joy and sadness that comes when something touches the deepest part of your soul. The applause continued for what felt like forever. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3, people didn't want to stop. They needed to express something that words couldn't capture. Sister Margaret slowly stood up from the piano bench. Her legs were shaky, but she managed, She gave a small, humble bow, the way she'd been taught to do many years ago. Then she started to walk off the stage, assuming the moment was over. "Wait." Mrs. Whitmore's voice rang out. The applause died down. "Please, Sister Margaret, wait." Sister Margaret paused at the edge of the stage, turning back. Mrs. Whitmore walked up to the stage stairs, moving with purpose despite her 72 years. She climbed up and crossed to where Sister Margaret stood. Then, in front of everyone, this wealthy, powerful woman took the old nun's hands in her own. "Do you remember what you told me?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her voice thick with emotion. 42 years ago, when I was 7 years old and I wanted to quit because I thought I wasn't good enough." Sister Margaret's eyes widened. She did remember. A shy little girl who cried after every lesson because she couldn't get her left hand to cooperate. "You told me," Mrs. Whitmore continued, "that music wasn't about being perfect. It was about being honest. You said that if I played with my whole heart, even if I hit wrong notes, it would be more beautiful than someone who played perfectly, but felt nothing." She squeezed Sister Margaret's hands gently. "You taught me that. And tonight you just showed all of us what you meant." The audience applauded again, softer this time, but no less genuine. Mrs. Whitmore turned to face them. "I want everyone here to understand something. This school talks about excellence and innovation and preparing students for the future, and those things are important. But what makes St. Catherine's special, what has always made it special, is teachers like Sister Margaret who understand that education isn't just about skills and careers. It's about forming human beings. It's about teaching young people that beauty matters, that dedication matters, that doing something with love is more valuable than doing something for success." She looked back at Sister Margaret. "I became successful in business. I made a lot of money. But the most important thing I learned in my life, I learned from you at that piano. You taught me what it means to care about something more than yourself." Mr. Patterson stood near the side of the stage, his face unreadable. But Sister Margaret noticed that his eyes were red. He'd been crying too. Mrs. Whitmore wasn't finished. She looked out at the audience again. "As the largest donor to this school, I have something to say about its future. We don't need to choose between tradition and innovation. We need both. We need teachers who understand technology, yes. But we also need teachers who understand the human heart." She turned to Mr. Patterson. "I'd like to propose that Sister Margaret be reinstated as a music teacher, not to replace anyone, but to work alongside. Let the students learn both. Let them have the benefit of modern tools and timeless wisdom." The applause erupted again, louder than before. People were nodding, calling out their agreement. Mr. Patterson stood frozen, caught between the pressure of the moment and his own pride. But then something unexpected happened. Trevor, the young music instructor, stepped forward. His face was red with embarrassment from the technical failure, but there was something else in his expression now. Something humble. "I think that's a great idea," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "I've been so focused on teaching them the tools that I forgot to teach them why the tools matter. Music isn't about equipment. I know that now." He looked at Sister Margaret. "I'd be honored to learn from you." Sister Margaret felt her throat tighten. She looked at this young man who had replaced her, who represented everything new and modern that had made her feel obsolete. And she saw in his eyes something genuine. He meant it. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. The entire auditorium was watching him now, waiting. He walked across the stage to Sister Margaret, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then he spoke, and his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "I made a mistake," he said simply. "I thought progress meant replacing the old with the new. I didn't understand that sometimes the old and the new can teach each other." He paused. "Sister Margaret, would you consider coming back to teach? However many classes you're comfortable with. Whatever schedule works for you." Sister Margaret looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly from playing. These old hands that she'd thought were useless. These hands that had just made 300 people cry. "Yes," she said quietly. "I would like that very much." The applause that followed was the loudest yet. People were cheering now, standing again, some of them calling out words of encouragement and support. Sister Margaret felt overwhelmed by it all, by the sudden reversal of everything she'd accepted as her fate. Mrs. Whitmore hugged her tightly, whispering in her ear, "Thank you for never giving up on me when I was small. I'll never give up on you." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. After the official program ended, person after person came up to Sister Margaret. Former students, parents of students, people who just wanted to shake her hand and thank her for the music. They told her stories she'd forgotten, memories of lessons and recitals and small kindnesses that had stayed with them for decades. Dr. Patel brought her daughter over, a shy 12-year-old who studied piano. "This is the teacher I told you about," Dr. Patel said to her daughter. "The one who made me love music." The girl looked up at Sister Margaret with wide eyes. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Sister Margaret smiled, feeling something warm spreading through her chest. Something that had been cold and dead for months was coming back to life. "I would love to," she said. When she finally left the auditorium, it was late. Most people had gone home. Sister Angela was waiting to drive her back to the convent, and she greeted Sister Margaret with a huge smile. "I heard what happened," Sister Angela said. "The whole thing. Sister Ruth called me. She was here and saw everything." Sister Margaret settled into the passenger seat, exhausted but somehow lighter than she'd felt in months. "I still can't believe it," she said. "I can," Sister Angela replied, starting the car. "You gave 40 years to those students. Tonight they gave something back." As they drove through the quiet streets, Sister Margaret looked out at the November darkness. The trees were bare and the air was cold, but somehow the world seemed different than it had that morning, brighter, more full of possibility. On Monday morning, Sister Margaret walked down the familiar corridor toward her old classroom. Her hands were still a bit stiff, still ached with arthritis, but she didn't mind. She'd learned something important over the past few months. Pain and beauty could exist together. Difficulty and grace could live side by side. The door to the music room was open. Inside, Trevor was setting up equipment for his morning class. But in the corner, back where it belonged, sat her old upright piano. Mr. Patterson had arranged to have it brought back over the weekend. Trevor looked up when she entered. "Good morning, Sister Margaret. I thought we could figure out the schedule together. Maybe I teach the first half of the week and you teach the second half? Or we could team teach some classes if you're open to it." Sister Margaret walked to the piano and ran her fingers along the keys. "I think team teaching sounds wonderful," she said. "You can show them how to use technology to create music. And I can show them why music is worth creating in the first place." Trevor smiled. "Deal." That afternoon, Sister Margaret taught her first class in months. 7 girls sat before her, a mix of beginners and intermediate students. Some had studied with Trevor. Others were new. One was Dr. Patel's daughter. "Music," Sister Margaret began, "is not about being perfect. It's not about impressing people or winning competitions. Music is about being human. It's about taking what you feel inside and giving it a voice." She sat at the piano and played a simple scale, C major, the most basic thing in the world. Even something this simple can be beautiful if you play it with attention and care. "Listen." She played the scale again, this time bringing out the melodic quality of each note, letting them ring and connect to each other like a conversation. The girls leaned forward, fascinated. Dr. Patel's daughter raised her hand. "Can you teach us to play like you did at the gala?" "My mom has the video. Everyone's been watching it." Sister Margaret blinked. "Video? It's gone viral," one of the other girls said. "Over 1 million views already? Everyone's sharing it." Sister Margaret didn't really understand what that meant, but it didn't matter. What mattered was these 7 girls in front of her, ready to learn. What mattered was the piano under her fingers, the familiar weight of the keys. What mattered was having purpose again, having something to give. "Let's start with something simple," she said, gesturing for the first student to come sit beside her at the piano. "We'll start with a lullaby. I wrote it a long time ago for someone who needed comfort, and I think it still has something to teach." As the girl's fingers found the keys, as Sister Margaret guided her hands gently, correcting her posture and encouraging her effort, everything felt right again. The gray days were over. The silence was over. The music had come back and Sister Margaret was home.